Hello, weary traveller. Come, sit by my fire. The night is long, and the stars above hold many secrets. I am the lonely knight, and tonight I shall share with you an account about how the Holy Church, in the long centuries after Rome's fall, claimed the authority to decide who among its flock was a witch, and what fate awaited those so accused. Close your eyes, if you will, and drift back with me to a time of honour, peril, and the song of steel at dawn. Tell me, wanderer, where do you listen from, and what hour finds you now? If my tale stirs something in you, then leave a like, and subscribe only if your heart says these stories are worth returning to. When the Western Roman Empire crumbled in the 5th century, its political structures dissolved into fragments. Yet the Catholic Church endured as a unifying force. Bishops and abbots stepped into the vacuum, not only as spiritual guides, but as mediators of law and order. In towns and countryside alike, their word carried weight beyond the pulpit, reaching into the governance of everyday life. Through monasteries, the written tradition survived, and with it, the Church's moral compass began to shape the laws of kingdoms. This enduring influence laid the foundation for its power over both souls and justice. Rulers sought legitimacy through blessing and coronation by churchmen, binding their reign to divine approval. Kings and lords knew that to oppose the Church's teachings was to risk losing the loyalty of subjects who feared for their eternal salvation. The intertwining of altar and throne created a system where earthly law could not easily be separated from canon law. In this way, disputes of faith became matters for the courts, and morality was no longer a private concern, but a public and punishable one. Canon law itself was a vast network of decrees, councils, and papal edicts, built upon centuries of theological reasoning. It governed baptism, marriage, burial, and the settlement of disputes between the faithful. Violating it could mean not just excommunication, but loss of property, or even life. In a world where religion defined identity, to be cast outside the Church's grace was to be exiled from society itself. Under such conditions, suspicion of wrongdoing, especially in matters of the supernatural, was never a light matter. In villages scattered across Europe, the parish priest became the interpreter of both God's will and the rules of conduct. His voice in the confessional might lead to quiet penance, or, in grave matters, to formal judgment before an ecclesiastical court. These courts were not confined to Rome. They existed in every diocese, forming an intricate web of authority. In them, accusations could pass from whispered rumor to recorded testimony, with outcomes that shaped reputations for generations. The Church's reach extended beyond the realm of the spirit, into the practical governance of life. It could dictate acceptable business practices, resolve disputes over land, and settle questions of inheritance. It judged not only the crimes of the body, but the alleged crimes of the soul. This gave it a unique ability to pursue cases that lay outside the concerns of secular lords, cases involving belief, heresy, and later, the suspicion of witchcraft. This authority was reinforced through ritual and ceremony. The sight of a bishop in procession, the weight of relics carried through the streets, and the chanting of Latin liturgies reminded all who watched that the Church was not merely an institution, but a presence woven into the fabric of existence. Those who defied it risked not just punishment in this life, but damnation in the next, a reality that made its court judgments both feared and rarely challenged. Even kings were subject to this power. Monarchs who fell out of favour with the papacy could find their lands placed under interdict. Their subjects denied the sacraments until the ruler submitted. Such measures revealed the Church's ability to bend even the highest crowns to its will. It was an influence built not on armies, but on the deep conviction that salvation lay in obedience to its authority. By the High Middle Ages, this blend of spiritual and temporal power created a climate in which accusations of spiritual crimes could be treated as matters for legal prosecution. From heresy to blasphemy, from sorcery to alleged dealings with dark forces, the Church had the recognized right to investigate and judge. And it was within this framework that the seeds of formal witch trials would find their soil, nurtured by centuries of unquestioned dominion over both faith and law. Long before the cross stood above every village church, the rhythms of life in Europe were marked by older rites. In the deep countryside, where priests came rarely and written law was a distant concept, the people clung to customs that had guided their ancestors for generations. They lit fires on solstices, left offerings at springs, and spoke charms over the sick. These practices, rooted in pagan belief, were not viewed as sinister by those who performed them. They were simply the way of keeping balance with the unseen world. As Christianity spread, its priests encountered these traditions at every turn. To many missionaries, the old rites were obstacles to salvation, evidence of souls still tethered to the worship of false gods. Yet outright destruction was not always possible, for the customs were woven into the fabric of daily life. Instead, the church often reinterpreted them, grafting Christian meaning onto pagan festivals. Midwinter feasts became celebrations of Christ's birth. Spring fertility rites were recast as blessings for the Virgin Mary. This blending was strategic, but it carried tension. For while the outward forms could be baptized into new meaning, the beliefs beneath them often remained unchanged. A farmer might attend Mass in the morning and still leave bread at a stone circle by night. Local healers might use herbs and prayers that carried the weight of both folk memory and forbidden invocations. The Church, ever watchful, began to mark such persistence as a danger to the purity of faith. In sermons and synods, pagan customs were increasingly condemned as superstitio, false and excessive practices that drew the soul away from God. Saints' lives were written to replace old myths, casting the Christian hero in the role once held by the village spirit or seasonal deity. The sacred groves were felled, wells were blessed in the name of saints, and processions carried relics to places where idols had stood. Yet the memory of the old ways did not vanish so easily. It was in rural isolation that these traditions found shelter. Far from the oversight of bishops, shepherds and midwives preserved charms for childbirth, weather, and protection against sickness. Their words were not written down, but passed from mouth to ear, changing little over centuries. To the Church, such secrecy gave them the air of defiance, and in later times, this secrecy would be read as evidence of alliance with darker forces. The tension between official doctrine and ancestral custom was not simply a matter of belief, but of authority. By branding the old ways as demonic, rather than merely mistaken, the Church strengthened its claim to be the sole guardian of truth. To seek aid from a pagan charm instead of the sacraments became, in the eyes of clerics, an act of rebellion against God himself. Thus, what had once been tolerated as ignorance began to be treated as sin. As generations passed, the line between pagan survival and heresy blurred. The same charm that had once been used to bless a harvest could, under suspicion, be recast as a curse. And when misfortune struck, a failed crop, a sick child, whispers might arise that such rituals had turned from healing to harm. In such moments, the Church's teaching provided a ready answer. These were the works of the devil, and those who performed them were his servants. This shift in perception laid the groundwork for future accusations. The survival of pagan traditions in Christian lands was no longer seen as harmless stubbornness, but as a seedbed for witchcraft. From the high pulpits to the smallest parish, the message grew louder. There could be no shared ground between the faith of Christ and the rites of the ancestors. In that divide, suspicion found fertile soil, ready to bear bitter fruit in the centuries to come. In the first centuries after the fall of Rome, the Christian understanding of magic was still forming. Learned men such as St. Augustine wrote with clarity against its use, yet his reasoning was rooted more in theology than in fear of conspiracies. He saw magic as a vain attempt to control what belonged to God alone, an error of pride and superstition rather than evidence of a pact with the devil. To him, those who practiced it were misled souls, not necessarily servants of evil forces. This view shaped the earliest judgments within the Church. Augustine's influence echoed through the writings of later church fathers, who distinguished between divine miracles and human deception. Miracles, they taught, came solely from God and confirmed the truth of the faith. Magic, in contrast, relied on illusions or the invocation of spirits outside God's order. Yet in these early centuries, the practitioner of such arts was more likely to be admonished, fined, or required to repent than to face death. The severity we now associate with witch trials had not yet taken root. Other early Christian thinkers, such as Isidore of Seville, continued this cautious stance. In his encyclopedic works, Isidore catalogued types of magic, astrology, divination, necromancy, not as organized heresies, but as misguided practices. His tone suggested that the danger lay in leading Christians astray, not in a grand conspiracy against Christendom. This intellectual climate allowed for a measure of leniency, especially when superstition was seen as ignorance rather than rebellion. In rural Europe, many of these so-called magicians were local healers, midwives, or wise men, whose remedies combined herbal knowledge with whispered prayers. The church might tolerate them so long as they did not openly claim to rival the sacraments or deny the authority of the clergy. A charm against fever could be forgiven if it invoked saints rather than pagan deities. This practical flexibility helped the faith spread without alienating entire communities. Still, there were limits. Those who called upon strange spirits, cast harmful spells, or practiced rites that mocked the sacraments drew harsher responses. Such acts could be treated as heresy, especially if they were linked to defiance of church authority. Yet even then, the idea of witches meeting in secret or worshipping the devil as a group was foreign to early doctrine. Magic was personal error, not yet framed as an organized threat to Christian society. Punishment often took the form of penance, fasting, almsgiving, or pilgrimage. The goal was correction, not elimination. Execution for magical crimes remained rare, and when it occurred, it was often under secular law rather than the authority of the church. Civil rulers concerned with public order might be quicker to punish sorcery harshly if it was tied to treason or harm against the ruler's subjects. This period also saw the blending of Roman legal traditions with Christian morality. Roman law had punished certain forms of magic, especially those causing harm, under the crime of maleficium. The church adopted this term, but in its earliest usage, it referred more to harmful deeds than to spiritual rebellion. Only in later centuries would maleficium become inseparable from the devil's work. In hindsight, these early centuries reveal a measured and even cautious approach. Magic was seen as sin, certainly, but not yet as the full embodiment of heretical evil. It would take centuries of theological evolution and the growing fear of Satan's active presence for this view to harden into the relentless pursuit of witches that later stained the courts of Europe. The patience of this earlier era would eventually give way to a far harsher climate. In the late 8th century, the Carolingian world was in the midst of transformation. Charlemagne's campaigns sought not only to expand his realm, but to unite it under a single faith. The Saxons, fierce in resistance, clung to their ancestral gods and rites, including the execution of those accused of witchcraft. To the Frankish king and his advisors, such killings were relics of pagan cruelty, incompatible with Christian mercy and order. It was in this context that the Synod of Paderborn gathered in the year 785. The Synod's decrees were clear. To burn or execute someone for witchcraft was itself a pagan act, and those guilty of it would face punishment. The message was striking in its reversal. Those who killed supposed witches were now seen as the true offenders. This ruling did not stem from disbelief in magic. Rather, it came from the desire to replace chaotic local justice with the authority of the Christian order. The Church sought to reshape not only belief but the application of power. Charlemagne's strategy was as political as it was spiritual. By condemning extrajudicial executions, he reinforced the role of central authority in matters of life and death. The Church, aligned with his vision, could extend its influence deep into newly converted territories. This alliance between crown and altar meant that faith and law would be inseparable tools in forging unity from conquest. The Synod of Paderborn thus served both salvation and statecraft. This decree also reflected the Church's cautious stance on superstition at the time. Magic was condemned, yes, but belief in its power did not justify murder outside lawful judgment. To kill without trial was to act in defiance of the order that both God and King demanded. In this way, the Synod upheld Christian teaching while curbing the blood feuds and mob violence that often plagued frontier communities. For the Saxons, this ruling marked yet another intrusion into their ancient customs. Where once accusations might have ended in swift and brutal execution, now they were subject to the oversight of foreign priests and royal officials. To the Franks, however, it was a sign of progress, proof that Christian justice could temper the passions of the crowd. This contrast in perception showed how deeply cultural change depended on the acceptance of authority. The decisions of Paderborn did not eliminate belief in witchcraft. Fear of harmful magic lingered in the hearts of villagers, as it had for generations. What changed was the channel through which that fear was to be addressed. The Church intended to bring such cases into its courts, where priests could determine guilt or innocence according to canon law, rather than leave it to the hands of the angry and the fearful. Over time, this principle would erode. Later centuries would see the very institution that once forbade witch executions become a driving force behind them. But in 785, the priority was different: to curb the chaos of pagan justice and assert a new moral and legal order. The Synod's stance was a reminder that power often shifts its methods while keeping its ultimate aims. Looking back, the Synod of Paderborn stands as a paradox in the history of witchcraft. It was both a moment of restraint and a step towards centralizing the authority that would, in later generations, be turned against the accused themselves. In its time, it was an attempt to tame the violence of belief. In the centuries that followed, belief would again find violent expression, this time with the Church as its judge. From the early Middle Ages onward, the Church sought to give structure to its moral authority through an ever-expanding body of canon law. These laws, drawn from Scripture, papal decrees, and decisions of councils, provided a framework for judging both spiritual and moral offences. They distinguished between acts sanctioned by divine authority and those condemned as superstition or heresy. In this codification lay the means to define precisely what separated a holy miracle from a forbidden magical act, and thus to determine guilt when suspicion arose. The distinction was not merely theological, but deeply practical. A miracle, when recognized by the Church, was evidence of God's power at work through a saint or relic. Magic, by contrast, was seen as an attempt to summon unnatural forces without divine sanction. This could be as simple as invoking unknown spirits for healing, or as serious as conducting rites thought to harm others. Canon law provided clear language for condemning the latter, ensuring that the faithful were taught to seek divine help only through approved channels. One of the enduring strengths of canon law was its adaptability. As new controversies arose, the Church could issue additional rulings to address them. Over time, these rulings created a living legal tradition capable of incorporating the judgments of influential theologians and adapting to local customs. In regions where folk practices persisted, these laws became the tools by which bishops and inquisitors could gradually replace them with authorized forms of devotion. In this legal order, intention mattered greatly. An act might be outwardly similar to a Christian blessing, but if its purpose was hidden or its words invoked alien powers, it could be condemned. This gave the Church a wide margin for determining which actions were permissible and which were dangerous. Such authority over the interpretation of intent placed much of the outcome in the hands of clerical judges, who relied on both doctrine and testimony to decide a case. It was also within canon law that heresy and superstition became linked. Heresy was defined as the obstinate denial of truths of the faith, while superstition was the wrongful use of religious practices or belief in powers apart from God. In combining these categories, the Church established that superstition could, under certain conditions, rise to the level of heresy, a classification that carried far more severe penalties. This set the stage for later treatment of witchcraft as a matter of spiritual treason. By the 12th century, collections such as Gratian's Decretum had brought order to centuries of scattered rulings. This monumental work gathered, compared, and harmonized diverse sources of church law, making them accessible to scholars and judges throughout Christendom. From the university lecture halls to the smallest diocesan court, these laws formed the foundation of ecclesiastical judgment. In them, the seeds of formal witch prosecutions already lay dormant, awaiting only the right conditions to sprout. The process by which cases were tried also reflected the values embedded in canon law. Investigations emphasized confession and repentance, but also recognized that obstinate refusal to recant could merit harsher measures. In this way, the law presented itself as both shepherd and sword, guiding the faithful towards salvation while punishing those who would not be led. Through these centuries, the role of canon law in shaping the perception of magic was subtle but profound. It did not invent the fear of sorcery, but it provided the legal scaffolding that allowed such fear to be acted upon with authority. What began as a means of clarifying spiritual truth would, in later years, become a primary instrument in the formal pursuit of those accused of serving forces deemed hostile to God. In the 13th century, the Church faced challenges that threatened not only doctrine, but the unity of Christendom itself. Movements such as the Cathars in southern France and the Waldensians in Italy rejected key teachings, spreading their beliefs with a fervor that alarmed ecclesiastical authorities. To counter this, the papacy established a system of formal investigation known as the Inquisition, an organized effort to identify, judge, and when necessary, punish heresy. This institution would, in time, become a template for dealing with accusations of witchcraft. The first papal directives for the Inquisition under Pope Gregory IX placed trained Dominican and Franciscan friars at its head. These orders, known for discipline and learning, were tasked with traveling from town to hold inquiries. They worked within a defined legal structure, collecting testimony, examining evidence, and urging repentance before imposing harsher sentences. The aim was to bring offenders back into the fold, though the process could be relentless in its pursuit of confession. At its heart, the Inquisition was an instrument of centralization. It shifted authority over matters of heresy away from local bishops, who might be swayed by politics or kinship, into the hands of agents directly appointed by Rome. This allowed the Church to maintain a more consistent approach across its territories, ensuring that doctrine was defended with uniform rigor. Such consistency would later make it easier to apply the same methods to the question of magic. Procedures developed for heresy trials laid the groundwork for later witch prosecutions. The use of sworn witnesses, the careful recording of testimony, and the reliance on written depositions all became standard. Defendants were often held in ecclesiastical prisons, where they awaited judgment under conditions meant to encourage repentance. The belief was that salvation of the soul outweighed all earthly concerns, even if the process caused hardship or fear. The Inquisition also shaped how suspicion itself was understood. To be accused was not proof of guilt, but it placed one in a dangerous position, as the refusal to answer questions could be taken as defiance. This principle, that silence might be interpreted as resistance to the truth, would later be applied to those suspected of witchcraft. In this way, the very posture of the accused could work against them. Its expansion across Europe demonstrated both adaptability and resolve. In Languedoc, inquisitors confronted organized heretical communities. In northern Italy, they pursued individuals quietly spreading forbidden teachings. Over time, the investigative model proved capable of addressing not just heresy, but any offense deemed to threaten the faith. This adaptability was key to its eventual role in matters of sorcery and diabolism. Though witchcraft was not the Inquisition's primary concern in its earliest decades, the link was slowly forged. By defining heresy as any obstinate error against the faith, inquisitors had a legal doorway to pursue magical practices if they could be tied to false belief. Thus, even before the Great Witch Panics, the machinery for such trials already existed, ready to be repurposed. In the centuries that followed, the Inquisition's methods would gain both fear and respect. For some, it represented the disciplined defense of truth. For others, it became a shadow looming over any who dared to speak or act against accepted doctrine. Its origins in the 13th century remain a pivotal moment, marking the creation of a judicial instrument that would outlive the movements it was first designed to suppress. As the medieval centuries advanced, Christian thought gave the devil a more active and personal role in the affairs of the world. Early writings had spoken of him as a tempter, the enemy of souls, but theologians of the High Middle Ages began to weave him into a far more elaborate and organized vision of evil. Through the works of scholars such as Thomas Aquinas, every act of magic, no matter how small, could be framed as the result of a pact, spoken or unspoken, with the Prince of Darkness himself. This shift would change how suspicion was judged. Aquinas argued that any attempt to wield supernatural power apart from God's will was, in essence, an alliance with demons. Such reasoning left little room for the old view of magic as harmless superstition. Even an herb charm, if believed to work through hidden forces, could be seen as drawing on infernal aid. The implication was stark. The magician was not merely misguided, but spiritually complicit in rebellion against the Creator. This theological stance found fertile ground in a society already attuned to signs and portents. Misfortunes, whether a sudden storm, a failed harvest, or unexplained illness, were increasingly interpreted as evidence of demonic interference. The devil, once thought distant, was now imagined as moving through villages and fields, working through human agents who had given him their loyalty. In such an atmosphere, fear of sorcery deepened into fear of organized evil. The association between magic and the devil also reshaped the way trials were conducted. Accusations no longer centered solely on harmful deeds, but on the spiritual allegiance of the accused. A person might be questioned not just about what they had done, but about visions, dreams, or the presence of a familiar spirit. In this, the Inquisition's methods for detecting heresy merged seamlessly with the growing demonological framework. Clerical writings began to describe elaborate ceremonies in which witches were said to renounce Christ and worship the devil in his physical form. Though these accounts were often based on confession under duress, they entered the public imagination as fact. Such descriptions gave theological weight to the idea that witchcraft was not an isolated act, but part of a vast conspiracy to undermine the faith. Art and preaching reinforced this vision. Frescoes depicted demons whispering into human ears. Manuscripts illustrated the torments of hell awaiting the unrepentant, and sermons warned that the devil's snares lay in seemingly harmless customs. The figure of Satan was thus made visible, not only as the ruler of the damned, but as an active commander of human agents on earth. This shift also influenced the classification of crimes. Since heresy was treason against God, and witchcraft was now considered its offspring, both could merit the same severe punishments. By drawing the devil into the heart of the accusation, the Church gave spiritual urgency to its pursuit of suspected witches, framing the trials as battles for the soul of Christendom. By the close of the 13th century, the devil had moved from the margins of magical belief to its very center. No longer a distant enemy, he was imagined as a constant presence, working through those who rejected divine law. This vision would dominate the coming centuries, ensuring that accusations of witchcraft carried not only social danger, but the weight of eternal war between good and evil. When the bishops of Christendom gathered in Rome for the Fourth Lateran Council, the city swelled with the weight of its purpose. Pope Innocent III presided over one of the most significant assemblies of the medieval church, drawing representatives from across Europe. The council's decrees reached into every corner of Christian life, shaping doctrine, discipline, and law. Among its many reforms, it established rules that would quietly but profoundly influence how accusations of spiritual crimes, including witchcraft, were pursued in centuries to come. One of the council's most enduring decisions was the formalization of inquisitorial procedure. While not yet focused on sorcery, these methods created a standard for investigating heresy, gathering testimony, questioning under oath, and placing the accused under moral obligation to answer. The process sought to remove disorder from trials by giving the Church a consistent framework to follow. In time, these same methods would be adapted to cases involving alleged dealings with the devil. The Council also made annual confession mandatory for all Christians, a measure that transformed the confessional into a tool of moral oversight. Priests, bound to secrecy, nonetheless became more aware of the sins and private practices of their parishioners. This closeness to the conscience of the people allowed the Church to detect deviations from orthodox belief more swiftly. A whispered admission of charms, spells, or folk rituals could be enough to raise questions that might later lead to formal inquiry. Doctrinal clarity was another goal. The Council reaffirmed the Church's authority to define the boundaries of acceptable belief and condemn practices that strayed beyond them. In doing so, it reinforced the link between spiritual error and legal culpability. What began as pastoral correction could, if persistent, be escalated into an ecclesiastical trial, a structure that left little room for compromise when accusations arose. The standardization of court procedure also strengthened the unity of Christendom's legal culture. Before this, local customs varied widely. After the Council, there was a growing expectation that the same principles would guide judgments from Spain to the Holy Roman Empire. This unity gave the Church a formidable reach, allowing suspicion to be pursued with similar vigor in distant lands under very different rulers. By placing greater emphasis on the elimination of heresy, the Council subtly expanded the scope of the Church's watchfulness. It was not only outspoken heretics who fell under scrutiny, but also those whose practices hinted at divided loyalties, people whose prayers or rituals seemed to blend Christian and non-Christian elements. In this way, the groundwork was laid for later treating witchcraft as a matter of doctrinal treason. The decisions of 1215 were framed as a defense of the faith, yet their long-term effect was to tighten the net of oversight. Ordinary believers might not notice the change immediately, but the machinery for investigating and judging spiritual crimes had been refined. Once set in motion, it could be applied to any offense the Church deemed dangerous to the unity of belief. In the decades that followed, the influence of the Fourth Lateran Council became visible in the rhythm of ecclesiastical courts and the vigilance of local clergy. Though the Council did not speak of witches directly, it gave future generations the legal and pastoral tools to pursue them. What began in 1215 as a consolidation of power in the name of order would echo through the centuries, shaping the very way accusations of witchcraft were heard, judged, and punished. In the medieval imagination, a woman's place was defined by the teachings of Scripture, the customs of her community, and the expectations of her family. She was to be obedient, modest, and dedicated to the household, whether as wife, daughter, or nun. Yet these ideals often left women vulnerable when they stood outside the accepted pattern. Widows, healers, and those without the protection of a male guardian attracted notice, for their independence unsettled a world that valued control over conformity. The Church's writings and sermons sometimes portrayed women as spiritually weaker, more prone to temptation, and thus more susceptible to the devil's lures. Eve's role in the fall was repeated from pulpit to pulpit, reinforcing the idea that a woman's moral resolve was fragile. This belief became a dangerous lens through which unusual behavior could be judged. A woman who spoke too boldly, lived alone, or worked with herbal remedies might be seen as stepping beyond her God-ordained bounds. Village life, with its close quarters and reliance on rumor, magnified suspicion. Quarrels between neighbors, disputes over property, or envy of another's prosperity could spark whispers. A barren woman might be accused of cursing another's fertility. A midwife whose patient died could be blamed for using malevolent magic. These suspicions did not need proof to take root, only a moment of misfortune and a community eager for explanation. Herbal knowledge, long respected for its practical uses, began to carry a darker shade in the later Middle Ages. Plants that eased childbirth, soothed fevers, or calmed the mind were increasingly linked to superstition. If such remedies succeeded, some claimed it was through forbidden powers. If they failed, the healer could be accused of causing harm on purpose. In either case, the woman who wielded such knowledge found herself in a precarious position. The economic position of women also played a role. Widows who managed their own property or traded in the market competed, however modestly, with male merchants and craftsmen. In times of scarcity, their success could breed resentment. Coupled with prevailing ideas about female weakness and moral danger, this resentment could quickly turn into an accusation of sorcery. Clerical and secular authorities alike recorded cases where women were brought before courts on charges rooted as much in gender prejudice as in genuine evidence. The pattern was consistent. Those without strong male allies were far more likely to be condemned. The courtroom became another arena where the cultural weight of suspicion bore down more heavily on women than on men. These attitudes were reinforced by theological writings that blended spiritual concern with inherited prejudice. Some authors argued that women were naturally more curious about forbidden knowledge, more inclined to speak with strangers, and thus more likely to engage in illicit rites. Such ideas were not merely private opinions, they shaped the questioning, the interpretation of evidence, and ultimately the verdict. Over time, this fusion of cultural norms and theological bias created a fertile ground for accusations that targeted women disproportionately. In an age where survival often depended on reputation, a single accusation could unravel a lifetime of quiet service. And when the charge was witchcraft, the weight of centuries-old suspicion made defense a perilous endeavor. The arrival of the plague in Europe was swift and merciless. Ships brought it to the ports, and from there it traveled along the trade routes, carried by merchants, pilgrims, and soldiers. Within months, entire towns were emptied, fields lay untended, and the tolling of church bells became a constant sound in the air. Fear spread faster than the disease itself, for no one could explain why God would allow such devastation to fall upon Christendom. As death mounted, the need for answers grew urgent. Priests preached of divine punishment for sin, urging repentance and prayer. Yet for many, this explanation was not enough. If God was just, then surely there must be enemies at work. Hidden agents whose deeds had brought this calamity upon the innocent. In this search for blame, suspicion fell upon the marginalized, the poor, the foreign, and those whose customs seemed strange. Among these, accusations of sorcery and maleficium began to take hold. People whispered that the plague was spread by those in league with the devil, poisoning wells or casting curses over entire villages. Though no proof was found, fear cared little for evidence. The need to act, to find and punish a cause, became as urgent as the need to bury the dead. The scale of mortality strained the fabric of society. In some places, half the population perished, in others, even more. Families vanished, guilds lost their masters, parishes were left without priests. This breakdown of order allowed rumor and superstition to fill the void. What might once have been dismissed as idle talk now carried the weight of desperate belief, and charges of witchcraft were increasingly heard in the courts. The plague also deepened the sense that unseen forces governed life and death. The devil's role, already emphasized in theological teaching, now seemed visible in every empty street and overgrown churchyard. To many, it was not unthinkable that he had human servants aiding his work. In such a climate, the accusation of witchcraft carried not just moral weight, but the fear of immediate, tangible danger. Communities sometimes turned against their own, targeting individuals who had survived when others around them died. A healer whose remedies seemed to spare a few might be celebrated in one season and condemned in the next. If her patients failed, she was useless. If they recovered, she was dangerous. The logic of fear could turn any outcome into suspicion. The Church, while often urging against mob violence, also absorbed these fears into its broader struggle against heresy. Sermons spoke of the plague as a sign of the end times, a punishment for tolerating sin within the community. In this moral accounting, rooting out sorcery became one path toward restoring divine favor, whether or not it had any true connection to the disease. In the years after the plague's worst wave, the memory of its horrors lingered. It left behind not only graveyards, but a heightened readiness to believe in hidden enemies. This readiness would persist, making future accusations of witchcraft all the more believable to those who had lived through the Black Death's shadow. For centuries, the village healer held a place of trust within rural communities. These men and women knew the herbs that eased pain, the poultices that drew out infection, and the prayers that soothed a troubled mind. Their skills were passed down through families or learned through long apprenticeship, blending practical knowledge with ritual. In many regions, they served as the first, and often only, source of medical aid for the poor. In earlier times, the Church's stance towards such healers was not uniformly hostile. If their remedies were framed as God's gifts from the earth, they might be tolerated, even valued. A blessing spoken over a medicinal herb could sanctify its use. But if those blessings invoked unnamed forces or pagan echoes, the healer's craft edged closer to suspicion. This fragile acceptance could be lost quickly, especially as church medicine became more formalized. By the late Middle Ages, university-trained physicians, often supported by ecclesiastical authority, began to challenge the place of traditional healers. Their practice was rooted in classical texts and humoral theory, and they were wary of remedies not sanctioned by learned tradition. In this competition, folk practitioners could be painted as rivals who endangered both body and soul by ignoring approved methods. The growing association between magic and diabolism deepened the rift. Remedies once seen as harmless were reinterpreted through the lens of demonology. A poultice of rare herbs might be viewed not as a natural cure, but as the work of spirits under a witch's control. Even healing that succeeded could be considered suspect, for it was believed the devil might grant temporary relief to bind souls in deeper bondage. Economic changes also played their part. As towns grew and markets expanded, some healers sought wider trade for their remedies, stepping beyond the invisible boundaries of their parish. This mobility, though good for business, made them strangers in the eyes of those they served, and strangers were easier to suspect than neighbors. A traveling healer who failed to cure could be accused of bringing illness instead. Women bore the heaviest burden of this shift. Midwives, long trusted to guide life into the world, found their knowledge reinterpreted as dangerous power. In times of high infant mortality, grief often sought a target, and the midwife's hands, once symbols of skill, could be cast as instruments of harm. In this way, the work most closely tied to nurturing life became one of the most vulnerable to accusation. The language of accusation changed as well. No longer was a failed cure simply incompetence. It could be called maleficium, harmful magic. This legal term carried weight in both secular and ecclesiastical courts, allowing the healer's work to be tried not merely as error, but as crime. The same person who had been thanked for a recovery might, in a different season, be condemned for a death. Over time, the healer's image in the collective mind darkened. The wise woman at the edge of the village became the suspected witch. Her remedies transformed into curses, her knowledge into proof of forbidden alliances. What had once been a role of service was recast as a threat, and the community's gratitude turned to fear. In that change lay one of the most enduring tragedies of the witchcraft era. In medieval Europe, the question of who had the right to try certain crimes was never simple. The Church claimed authority over spiritual offenses, heresy foremost among them. while secular lords governed the realm of theft, violence, and property disputes. Yet accusations of witchcraft straddled these boundaries, touching both the soul and the community's safety. This overlap often led to disputes over whether the bishop's court or the Lord's hall should hear the case. Ecclesiastical courts approached witchcraft as a matter of faith. Their judges, bishops, archdeacons, or inquisitors were concerned with the accused's beliefs, intentions, and possible alliance with the devil. Procedures followed canon law, emphasizing confession, repentance, and penance. The focus, at least in theory, was the salvation of the soul, though severe sentences could still follow if the accused remained defiant. Secular courts, in contrast, viewed witchcraft primarily through its material effects. If spells were believed to have caused death, ruined crops, or damaged property, these became matters of public harm. Such cases were tried alongside other crimes, and punishments could be swift and physical. In regions where Roman law had greater influence, maleficium was treated as a serious offense, warranting execution. This dual system created tension, especially in areas where both authorities had strong influence. A person accused in a secular court might also be summoned before an ecclesiastical judge, facing two separate inquiries for the same acts. Conversely, some communities saw cases stalled as church and state argued over who held rightful jurisdiction. These delays could deepen suspicion, as villagers interpreted the absence of judgment as proof of hidden guilt. At times, cooperation bridged the divide. Secular rulers might hand over spiritual matters to the church, trusting its courts to handle the religious dimension, while retaining authority to enforce physical punishments. In other situations, the church might collect testimony and pass it to the Lord's court for sentencing. This blending of processes could intensify the ordeal for the accused, as they were judged by two powers instead of one. Political interests often shaped the outcome. A lord might press for secular trial to assert control over his lands, especially if property forfeiture was involved. A bishop, on the other hand, might seek to claim the case to demonstrate his vigilance against heresy. In both settings, witchcraft could become a stage upon which authority itself was displayed. The people living under this system learned quickly that the path of accusation could be unpredictable. A quarrel between neighbors might begin as a local complaint, only to rise to the ears of a priest and be reframed as a spiritual crime. Likewise, a charge first raised before the bishop could be transferred to the Lord if harm to life or property was alleged. Through these overlapping jurisdictions, witchcraft trials became both a legal and a political act. The accused stood at the crossroads of two systems, each with its own laws, priorities, and penalties. In that intersection lay both the danger of double judgment and the full weight of medieval authority, ready to shape fate according to its own needs. In the early 14th century, Pope John XXIII faced a Europe unsettled by political rivalries, outbreaks of disease, and whispers of sorcery even within the Church's own ranks. Reports reached him of clerics and laymen alike engaging in magical rites, some allegedly aimed at harming the Pope himself. In response, he issued the papal bull Super Ilius Specula in 1326, a decree that firmly bound magic to the crime of heresy and gave inquisitors the authority to investigate it as such. This document marked a turning point. Where earlier, church law had often distinguished superstition from heresy, the bull collapsed the distance between them. To practice harmful magic, or even to attempt to summon spirits, was now treated as an act of rebellion against God. The accused could be pursued with the same vigor reserved for those who openly denied the faith. This was no longer a matter of misguided custom. It was defined as a direct threat to Christendom. The language of the bull was unambiguous. It condemned not only those who used spells and incantations, but also those who sought to learn or teach them. This widened the net considerably, allowing the investigation of scholars, alchemists, healers, and anyone suspected of dabbling in forbidden arts. Even possession of certain books could be grounds for inquiry, especially if they contained instructions for invoking supernatural powers. By granting inquisitors this expanded jurisdiction, super ilia specula centralized control over how magical crimes were defined and prosecuted. Local bishops, who might have been more lenient or influenced by local custom, were now bound to follow the papal standard. The decree thus ensured a more uniform and often harsher approach across Christendom. The political climate made the bull's impact even greater. In the papal court at Avignon, tensions with rival powers fueled paranoia. Accusations of magic became tools not only for religious purification, but for political maneuvering. Those suspected of conspiring against church authority could be charged with sorcery, placing them in the crosshairs of the Inquisition. For common people, the decree meant that long-standing practices, once tolerated or ignored, could suddenly draw dangerous scrutiny. A charm for protection, a whispered prayer over an illness, or the keeping of certain talismans could now be construed as signs of heretical intent. Fear of denunciation grew, and with it, the readiness to denounce others. Clergy, too, were not exempt. The bull explicitly addressed the scandal of priests accused of magical dealings, reinforcing the idea that no rank placed one above the law of God. In this way, the papacy sought to preserve its moral authority while eliminating threats to its spiritual and political supremacy. By the time super ilia specula had taken root, the stage was set for the next century's witchcraft persecutions. Its redefinition of magic as heresy ensured that those accused would face not only local suspicion, but the full machinery of ecclesiastical justice. What began as a papal response to perceived threats in Avignon would echo for generations across Europe. In the medieval courts of Europe, confession was considered the highest proof of guilt, a direct acknowledgement that the accused had sinned before God and man. The Church's legal tradition valued voluntary admission above all, believing that truth, once spoken, could cleanse the soul. Yet when it came to alleged witches and heretics, obtaining such admissions was often difficult. Accused individuals frequently denied wrongdoing, even under the weight of community suspicion. To overcome this resistance, ecclesiastical courts began to sanction the use of torture as a means of uncovering hidden truths. This decision did not arise in a vacuum. Medieval theology held that witches were protected by the devil, who could give them the strength to lie or remain silent. Under such belief, ordinary questioning was seen as insufficient to break the accused's allegiance to evil. Torture, then, was justified as a way to shatter this demonic protection, freeing the person to confess and seek repentance. The logic was presented as spiritual medicine, even as it caused immense physical suffering. The methods varied from place to place, but shared the same grim purpose. The strappado, in which the accused was hoisted by the arms tied behind their back, could dislocate shoulders within minutes. The rack stretched limbs beyond their natural limits. More localized practices included crushing devices for fingers or legs, water ordeals, or prolonged confinement in darkness and cold. Each method was meant to wear down both body and will. Torture was rarely applied without formal authorization. Church law required that its use be approved by a judge, carried out in the presence of officials, and stopped once a confession was obtained. In theory, it could not be used to cause permanent injury or death. In practice, these limits were often ignored or interpreted loosely, especially when the court believed the accused was hiding greater crimes. The psychological effect was as potent as the physical. The accused knew that resistance could mean repeated sessions, each more severe than the last. Many broke quickly, confessing to whatever was suggested by their interrogators. These confessions often contained fantastical elements: night flights, pacts with demons, attendance at secret gatherings that mirrored the questions asked, revealing more about the beliefs of the inquisitors than the lived reality of the accused. Once extracted, these admissions carried great weight in court. They were read aloud as proof of guilt, even if later recanted. A confession under torture was considered binding, and retraction was seldom accepted as evidence of innocence. The mere act of confessing, no matter the circumstances, was taken as acknowledgement of the Church's authority over the soul in question. Criticism of torture did exist, even within ecclesiastical circles. Some theologians warned that false confessions could lead to injustice, undermining the very moral order the Church sought to protect. Others argued that the devil, if truly as powerful as claimed, could as easily compel a false confession as prevent a true one. Yet such voices were often drowned out by the urgency of rooting out perceived threats. By making torture a sanctioned tool, the Church bound its judicial process to a practice that blurred the line between justice and coercion. The image of a voluntary confession gave way to one extracted through agony, and with it, the meaning of truth itself was reshaped. In the pursuit of salvation through judgment, the methods used left scars, both on the bodies of the accused and on the conscience of the age. In most cases, the spark that ignited a witch trial did not come from bishops or papal decrees, but from the murmurs of a community. Villages, bound together by close ties and shared labor, were also fertile ground for envy, resentment, and suspicion. A quarrel over a boundary, a loan left unpaid, or an insult exchanged in the market could simmer until misfortune struck. Then the blame found its target. These personal grievances often grew into formal accusations, carried from hearthside whispers to the ears of local authorities. The death of livestock, a spoiled harvest, or a sudden illness provided the perfect soil for such claims to grow. In times when the causes of disease or crop failure were unknown, human malice was a convenient explanation. If a neighbor had been seen muttering by a field or refusing to share bread at a feast, such details became evidence in the minds of the fearful. Once suspicion took hold, ordinary events were reinterpreted through a lens of guilt. Women, especially those living alone or outside the village's social core, bore the brunt of these charges. A widow, who managed her affairs without deference to others, might be seen as proud. A healer, whose remedies failed, could be accused of deliberate harm. These perceptions were shaped as much by local relationships as by theological teaching, showing how personal dynamics could fuel the machinery of prosecution. Local courts and parish priests often acted as the first arbiters of these disputes. The priest might be called to settle a quarrel or hear confession related to the accusation. If the matter seemed grave, it could be passed to higher authorities. In this way, the smallest spark, a casual remark, a fleeting suspicion, could find its way into the formal record, gaining weight with each retelling. Rumors were powerful currency in these tight-knit communities. They could cross from one household to another in the space of an evening, altered and sharpened with each repetition. The accused often found themselves fighting not a single claim, but a tapestry of small grievances woven together into a larger narrative of wrongdoing. Once woven, this fabric was difficult to tear apart. Even those who doubted the accusation might hesitate to speak out. To defend a suspected witch could be seen as aligning with her, placing oneself under suspicion. Silence, therefore, became the safer choice, allowing the process to move forward unchecked. The absence of defense only strengthened the case in the eyes of those already convinced of guilt. These local accusations reveal how the persecution of witches was not simply imposed from above, but also rose from below. Communities played an active role in identifying, isolating, and condemning individuals they saw as dangerous. In this sense, witch trials reflected not only ecclesiastical policy, but also the anxieties and conflicts of daily life. When such cases reached the Church's courts, they carried the weight of local testimony, accounts shaped by memory, bias, and fear. In the eyes of the judges, these voices formed the foundation of the case, even if they sprang from disputes as old as the accused themselves. In the fragile balance of medieval life, a neighbor's word could be as dangerous as a noble's decree. By the later Middle Ages, the fear of witchcraft had acquired its own set of proofs. a collection of signs and trials meant to unmask the guilty. These methods were drawn from a mixture of folklore, superstition, and flawed theology, and they varied from one region to another. Though intended to bring certainty, they often reflected the expectations of the accusers more than any tangible reality. In many cases, the very act of testing ensured the outcome the authorities desired. One of the most common signs was the so-called witch's mark, a spot on the body believed to be insensible to pain and left by the devil as a seal of allegiance. Searchers, sometimes appointed by the court, would examine the accused in invasive and humiliating ways, pricking suspicious moles or blemishes with needles. If no pain or bleeding followed, it was taken as proof of guilt, though the test itself was riddled with error and bias. Another notorious method was the swimming ordeal. The accused would be bound and lowered into water under the belief that pure water, as God's creation, would reject the guilty and cause them to float. Those who sank were considered innocent, though they risked drowning before they could be pulled to safety. Those who floated, ironically, were judged guilty and faced trial with this evidence against them. Less physically dangerous, but equally flawed, were the observation of behavioral signs. An accused person's calmness could be interpreted as a sign of hardened guilt, while visible distress might be taken as proof of a guilty conscience. Illness in animals, sudden storms, or unexplained accidents that occurred near the accused could be cited as confirmation of magical activity, regardless of coincidence or natural cause. Some tests drew on ritual. In certain places, bread and cheese were blessed and given to the accused to eat. Choking was seen as a sign of witchcraft. In others, the recitation of prayers under close scrutiny was used, with any stumble or hesitation counted against the suspect. These trials blurred the line between spiritual examination and superstition, often relying on the same fear they claimed to dispel. The theological defense for such methods lay in the belief that the devil's servants could hide their crimes through deception. Tests were meant to pierce this veil, revealing the truth that ordinary questioning could not. Yet this presumption meant that innocence was nearly impossible to prove. Every result could be interpreted in a way that confirmed the charge. Local communities often accepted these tests without question, for they aligned with familiar beliefs about magic and divine justice. To see the accused subjected to such ordeals gave the appearance of fairness, even when the procedures were designed to produce a predetermined conclusion. In this way, the rituals of testing reinforced the authority of those conducting them. The legacy of these signs and tests was grim. They gave physical form to fear, making suspicion visible and provable in the eyes of both courts and communities. But in truth, they revealed more about the mindset of the age than about the reality of witchcraft, turning superstition into sanctioned judgment and sealing the fate of many who could never meet a standard of innocence that was never meant to be met. In the mid-15th century, the Dominican theologian Johannes Nieder composed a work that would leave a lasting mark on the study and prosecution of witchcraft. Written between 1437 and 1439, the Formicarius, meaning the ant hill, was intended as a moral guide, using the structure of a dialogue between a theologian and a layman to explore various forms of sin and virtue. One of its volumes dealt specifically with sorcery, giving shape to ideas that would dominate the later witch hunts. Nider's treatment of witchcraft was distinctive for its detail. He presented the figure of the witch not as an isolated trickster, but as part of an organized and deliberate movement allied with the devil. Here appeared some of the earliest written descriptions of pacts with demons, night flights, and the gathering of witches in secret assemblies. These elements, while not entirely new, were arranged into a coherent theory that could be cited by preachers and inquisitors alike. The Formicarius also emphasized the moral corruption of witchcraft, portraying it as a willful rejection of God in favor of diabolical service. This framing reinforced the Church's growing tendency to classify such acts as heresy rather than mere superstition. In doing so, Nider's work bridged the older, more cautious view of magic with the emerging doctrine that demanded harsher prosecution. While his accounts were often drawn from inquisitorial testimony, they were shaped by the questions and expectations of the judges who gathered them. The accused, under pressure, often repeated or embellished details suggested during interrogation. These stories, recorded and refined in Nida's text, would be taken as factual reports of witch behavior, influencing both scholarly opinion and public imagination. Importantly, Nida distinguished between learned magicians, educated men practicing ritual magic, and the mostly female peasant witches he described in the Formicarius. This division reinforced gendered assumptions, presenting women as more susceptible to demonic influence because of perceived moral weakness. Such distinctions would fuel the disproportionate targeting of women in later prosecutions. The work also tied witchcraft to broader social anxieties. Nida linked the spread of sorcery to times of war, famine, and plague, suggesting that instability created fertile ground for the devil's servants to act. In this way, witchcraft became a convenient explanation for misfortune, aligning with fears already present in village life. The Formicarius was widely read, especially among the clergy and scholars involved in ecclesiastical courts. It provided a structured, theologically grounded argument for the reality and danger of witches, reinforcing the need for vigilance. Even where local customs had previously allowed for tolerance of certain folk practices, the book's authority could shift attitudes towards stricter enforcement. By assembling scattered beliefs into a single organized vision, Nida's work became a cornerstone of late medieval demonology. Its influence would extend far beyond his lifetime, laying the intellectual foundation for the witch-hunting manuals and legal codes of the following century. What began as a moral treatise became, in effect, a blueprint for persecution. In the final decades of the 15th century, fears of witchcraft had intensified across parts of the Holy Roman Empire. Reports reached Rome of regions where authorities claimed witches were causing storms, destroying crops, and inflicting illness on people and livestock. Pope Innocent VIII, responding to petitions from inquisitors in Germany, issued the bull Summis Desiderantes Effectibus in 1484. This decree affirmed the reality of such crimes and granted full authority to pursue and punish those accused, removing any doubt about the Church's position. The bull was addressed directly to Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, Dominican inquisitors whose work would soon become infamous. By giving them explicit permission to investigate witchcraft as heresy, the papacy reinforced the idea that these acts were not merely local disturbances but threats to the entire Christian order. In doing so, it strengthened the link between sorcery and rebellion against God, ensuring that witchcraft would be prosecuted with the same fervor as doctrinal treason. One of the document's key functions was to silence resistance from local clergy or secular rulers who might question the inquisitor's authority. In some regions, bishops had been hesitant to support aggressive witch prosecutions, either out of doubt or concern for overreach. Summis Desiderantes removed such obstacles, declaring that refusal to assist the inquisitors would be a failure of duty to the Church. The bull's language painted witchcraft as a systematic conspiracy. It spoke of men and women who have abandoned themselves to devils, engaging in harmful magic, flying through the air, and attending nocturnal assemblies. Whether these descriptions came from theological imagination or coerced confessions, they set a precedent. To deny such practices existed was, implicitly, to deny church teaching. Its issuance also came at a time when print was beginning to spread ideas more quickly than ever before. The text of the bull was copied, circulated, and read far beyond the confines of legal courts. It served as both a legal instrument and a piece of propaganda, shaping public perception of witchcraft as a pressing, real, and immediate danger. For Kramer in particular, the bull was a powerful endorsement. He would later cite it in the opening pages of the Malleus Maleficarum as proof that his work had papal backing. Whether or not the bull explicitly supported all of his later methods, it gave him the authority he needed to act without fear of ecclesiastical challenge. In local communities, its effect was to add gravity to accusations. To charge someone with witchcraft was now to accuse them of a crime recognized at the highest level of the Church. Trials could proceed with a sense of divine mandate, and verdicts could be justified as part of a larger spiritual battle. The Summis Desiderantes Affectibus thus stands as a pivotal moment in the history of witch persecution. It did not invent the fear, nor did it create the practice of prosecution, but it solidified the legal and theological framework that would carry Europe into some of its most relentless hunts. In giving inquisitors such unambiguous authority, the papacy ensured that witchcraft was no longer a matter of local discretion. It was an offence against the whole of Christendom. Just 3 years after the papal bull Summis Desiderantes Affectibus, Heinrich Kramer published the work that would become the most notorious manual on witch hunting in European history, the Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches. Intended as both a theological treatise and a practical guide for inquisitors, it gathered arguments, legal procedures, and detailed descriptions of alleged witchcraft into one volume. Its influence would be vast, shaping trials for more than 2 centuries. The book was divided into 3 parts. The first argued for the existence and danger of witches, countering skeptics who doubted their reality. Kramer insisted that to deny witchcraft was itself heretical, thereby placing disbelief in the same category as the crime itself. The second part described alleged magical practices, from harming livestock to pacts with the devil, often drawing from confessions extracted under duress. The third laid out trial procedures, including the use of torture to secure confessions and the conditions under which execution was warranted. A central theme of the Malleus was its deep mistrust of women. Kramer claimed that women were more prone to witchcraft due to supposed weaknesses in faith, moral character, and intellect. He cited Eve's role in the fall and leaned heavily on stereotypes of female envy and deceit. This reasoning further entrenched the gender imbalance in witch trials, where women, especially widows, healers, and the poor, were most often accused. The manual's legal advice was both precise and dangerous. It instructed inquisitors on how to frame questions, interpret evidence, and overcome resistance from the accused. Silence, hesitation, or denial could be taken as proof of guilt, and witnesses could be accepted even if they were themselves of questionable reputation. Such guidance tilted the scales heavily toward conviction. The Malleus also blurred the lines between spiritual and temporal authority. While rooted in canon law, it urged secular rulers to enforce its judgments, merging religious doctrine with the penalties of civil courts. In doing so, it encouraged cooperation between churchmen and magistrates in the pursuit of witchcraft cases, increasing the reach and severity of prosecutions. Its success was amplified by the printing press, a relatively new force in European life. Dozens of editions appeared across the continent, ensuring that Kramer's ideas reached judges, priests, and lay readers alike. With each reprint, the text's authority grew, and local customs of justice increasingly aligned with its harsh prescriptions. Criticism did exist, even from within the Church. Some theologians questioned Kramer's interpretations and methods, arguing that his work relied too heavily on fear and prejudice. Yet such voices were often drowned out by the urgency the Malleus projected, portraying witchcraft as an existential threat that demanded immediate and ruthless action. In time, the Malleus Maleficarum became more than a book. It was a symbol of the era's uncompromising stance against perceived evil. It provided a ready-made justification for trials that might otherwise have faltered and lent an air of scholarly legitimacy to the destruction of countless lives. Through its pages, fear was given form, and form was given the weight of law. By the late 15th century, the legal and theological currents of Europe had converged to redefine witchcraft as a form of heresy. This was not a mere shift in terminology. It was a transformation in how the crime was understood, prosecuted, and punished. Heresy was the ultimate offense against God and the unity of the Church, and by framing witchcraft in these terms, the authorities placed it among the gravest threats to Christendom. In earlier centuries, harmful magic had been treated as superstition or as a criminal act under secular law. punishable according to local custom. Now, under the influence of papal decrees, inquisitorial procedure, and works like the Malleus Maleficarum, it was seen as a conscious rejection of the faith. To be accused of witchcraft was to be accused not only of harming one's neighbor, but of betraying God himself. This redefinition carried profound legal consequences. Heresy trials followed strict inquisitorial forms, granting church courts wide authority to investigate, detain, and question suspects. Evidence could include testimony from those with personal grievances, dreams, or visions interpreted as divine revelations. Once labeled a heretic, the accused fell under penalties that could extend to excommunication, forfeiture of property, and execution. The theological reasoning was rooted in the belief that witches entered into an explicit or implicit pact with the devil. This pact was viewed as a direct parallel to the profession of faith made by Christians at baptism, only inverted and corrupted. The witch renounced God, pledged loyalty to Satan, and thus placed themselves entirely outside the community of the faithful. By making witchcraft heresy, the Church justified its harshest measures. The salvation of the accused soul was still, in theory, the goal. Repentance could spare them from death. But in practice, confession often came only after prolonged interrogation or torture, and those who refused to confess were condemned as obstinate enemies of the faith. The severity of heresy law left little room for doubt or leniency. The shift also invited closer cooperation between ecclesiastical and secular authorities. Since heretics were often handed over to civil courts for execution after ecclesiastical condemnation, witchcraft cases now moved seamlessly from pulpit to gallows. This union of spiritual judgment and temporal punishment ensured that accusations, once formalized, could easily lead to death. For ordinary people, this merging of witchcraft and heresy intensified fear. Accusations now implied eternal damnation as well as earthly peril. To be suspected was to face both divine and human judgment, each reinforcing the other. Communities became more willing to denounce, believing they were aiding in the defense of faith itself. In binding witchcraft to the crime of heresy, medieval Europe locked suspicion into its most unforgiving legal framework. The result was a prosecution that claimed to protect the soul while destroying the body, and that saw no contradiction in doing both. This was the foundation upon which the great witch hunts of the early modern period would be built. Across late medieval and early modern Europe, there were moments when the fear of witchcraft burst beyond isolated cases into waves of accusation that engulfed entire regions. These mass trials, sometimes lasting months or even years, often began with a single incident, a failed harvest, an outbreak of disease, or a violent storm that demanded explanation. In communities primed by decades of preaching about the devil's agents, suspicion spread like wildfire. One of the earliest large-scale hunts took place in the Valais region of present-day Switzerland during the 1420s and 1430s. Reports tell of dozens, perhaps hundreds, of people accused, many of them confessing under torture to attending Sabbaths, flying through the night, and conspiring with demons to harm the land. Whether these accounts reflected truth or the expectations of inquisitors, they formed a template for later mass persecutions. In 15th century Arras, a series of accusations began with a small circle of individuals and soon expanded to implicate members of the local elite. The trials produced lurid testimony of nocturnal feasts, pacts sealed with the devil's kiss, and supernatural travel. When doubts later arose about the veracity of the confessions, some convictions were overturned, but not before lives had been lost and reputations destroyed. The German-speaking lands would become notorious for the intensity of such panics. In parts of the Holy Roman Empire, entire villages were swept into chains of accusation. The combination of local courts eager to act, secular rulers seeking to assert authority, and religious leaders warning of the devil's work created a perfect storm. Once a few were condemned, the accused were pressured to name others, feeding an ever-widening net of suspicion. Panic altered the normal pace of justice. Trials moved quickly, often with little time for defense. Witnesses were not always questioned independently, and rumors could be treated as proof. In some hunts, records show that dozens could be executed in a matter of weeks, their property seized, and their names erased from the protection of community. These large-scale hunts revealed the fragility of social bonds. Old rivalries, debts, and grudges resurfaced under the guise of religious duty. Accusations might pass along family lines or leap from neighbor to neighbor until the sense of safety within the village was entirely shattered. In such an atmosphere, silence was no refuge. Failure to accuse could be read as a sign of complicity. Clergy and secular authorities often reinforced the panic rather than calming it. Sermons warned that the devil was gathering his forces. Proclamations called on the faithful to root out his servants. In this heightened state, trials became more than legal proceedings. They were public demonstrations of moral vigilance, spectacles meant to reassure the unaccused that the danger was being confronted. The legacy of these mass trials was deep and enduring. They left behind not only a toll of executions, but a cultural memory that witchcraft could threaten entire communities at once. This idea, repeated across generations, ensured that future outbreaks of fear would find a ready script to follow, carrying forward the cycle of suspicion, accusation, and destruction. Within the framework of medieval and early modern witch trials, confession held a central place. It was considered not only the strongest form of legal proof, but also a necessary step for the salvation of the accused's soul. Yet many confessions were not freely given. They were obtained under conditions designed to break resistance: prolonged imprisonment, relentless questioning, physical torment, and the constant reminder that refusal to confess was itself a sign of guilt. Once the process began, interrogators rarely sought simple admissions. They encouraged or pressured the accused to give detailed narratives of their supposed crimes. These accounts often followed a pattern: attendance at a nocturnal Sabbath, renunciation of the faith, pledging service to the devil, and engaging in acts of harmful magic. The uniformity of such stories across different trials suggests they were shaped as much by the questions asked as by the accused's own words. Torture, whether sanctioned by ecclesiastical or secular courts, played a decisive role in producing these narratives. Under extreme pain, people spoke whatever they believed would bring the ordeal to an end. Inquisitors interpreted this as truth revealed, even when the confessions contained fantastical or contradictory elements. Once recorded, these statements became part of the permanent legal record, reinforcing the belief that such crimes were real and widespread. The accused were often compelled to name others, further fueling the cycle of suspicion. A confession that implicated fellow villagers, relatives, or neighbors was seen as cooperation with justice. This practice ensured that a single accusation could ripple outward, drawing more people into the web of inquiry and multiplying the number of trials. Retracting a confession after torture was extremely difficult. Courts tended to view retraction as a sign of relapse into heresy or a renewed pact with the devil. In many cases, such denials were ignored entirely, and the original torture-induced statement was taken as the definitive truth. This meant that once a confession was extracted, it was nearly impossible for the accused to undo its consequences. Beyond its legal weight, confession served a powerful symbolic function. Public readings of the accused's own words were meant to confirm the righteousness of the court's actions. For the audience, hearing the supposed crimes from the mouth of the condemned reinforced the moral and spiritual narrative that justified the trial. Some contemporaries questioned the reliability of such testimony, noting the ease with which suffering could force lies. Yet their skepticism rarely altered the process. The demand for confession was deeply woven into both legal custom and theological reasoning, and the fear of letting an unrepentant witch go free outweighed concerns over potential falsehoods. In this way, confession under duress became both the means and the end of witch prosecutions. It created the evidence required to convict, validated the worldview that sustained the trials, and provided a script for future interrogations. But it also left an enduring record of voices speaking not from freedom, but from the shadow of the rack and the cell. As the witch trials of Europe gathered force, a new body of learned writing emerged to explain, categorize, and justify the prosecution of witchcraft. This demonological scholarship, produced by theologians, jurists, and clerics, sought to give intellectual weight to beliefs about the devil and his human agents. It drew upon earlier theological traditions, but wove them into elaborate systems that blended theology, law, and folklore into a unified doctrine. The works varied in tone and scope, but many shared common aims: to prove the reality of witchcraft, to identify its signs, and to instruct authorities in its eradication. Authors like Nicolas Jacquier, Martin Del Rio, and Jean Baudin offered detailed accounts of alleged demonic practices, from pacts sealed in blood to assemblies where witches received instructions from their infernal master. These descriptions, often taken from confessions under duress, were presented as factual case studies. One of the most striking features of this literature was its tendency to treat witchcraft as an organized, almost military conspiracy. The devil was imagined as a commander, witches as his soldiers, and Europe as a battlefield where Christendom itself was under siege. This martial framing gave urgency to legal action, portraying trials and executions as acts of spiritual defense. Demonologists often work to reconcile observed events with theological principles. If a storm destroyed a harvest, they might explain it as the result of demonic manipulation permitted by God as punishment for sin. If a healer cured an illness, they might argue the cure was granted by the devil to deceive the faithful. In this way, both good and bad fortune could be interpreted as evidence of the witch's hand. The printing press amplified the reach of these treatises. Manuals once confined to clerical libraries could now be purchased, copied, and read by secular judges, local magistrates, and educated laypeople. This meant that the same demonological framework could influence trials in widely separated regions, helping to standardize accusations and legal procedures. Such scholarship also hardened the link between witchcraft and heresy. By embedding witch beliefs into canon law and moral theology, it left little room for skepticism within official circles. To question the existence of witches became, in the eyes of some writers, a form of complicity with the devil. This intellectual pressure reinforced the fervor of both ecclesiastical and secular courts. Despite the veneer of scholarship, these works were often rooted in fear and moral panic. Their reliance on coerced testimony, anecdotal evidence, and theological presumption created a self-confirming system in which every sign pointed to the same conclusion. Once codified in print, these ideas took on a permanence that oral rumor could never achieve. In the end, demonological literature served as both a map and a mirror. It charted the imagined geography of the devil's influence, while reflecting the anxieties of an age caught between faith and fear. Through its pages, witchcraft was given a coherent identity that could be pursued with conviction, ensuring that the trials would not fade quickly from Europe's legal and religious landscape. Throughout Europe, accusations of witchcraft were not only instruments of religious zeal, but could also be shaped by political motives. In times of power struggles, the charge of consorting with the devil provided a weapon that could destroy reputations and remove rivals under the guise of defending the faith. The blending of theology and politics gave such accusations a force that neither alone could have wielded so effectively. In noble courts, the suspicion of sorcery could be used to undermine alliances. A rival claimant to a title might find themselves accused of magical malice, their supposed crimes amplified by the very networks they once relied upon. These accusations carried weight because they touched both spiritual and secular fears, uniting bishops and rulers in a common cause against a perceived threat. Urban politics also provided fertile ground for such charges. In city-states like those of northern Italy, where merchant families competed for influence, a scandal of witchcraft could discredit an opponent more effectively than any public debate. By linking an adversary's household to forbidden rites, a faction could sway public opinion and secure advantage without open warfare. At the village level, disputes over land, inheritance, or local leadership could be reframed as matters of sorcery. A prosperous farmer might be accused by neighbors jealous of his success, or a community leader might face charges if their decisions angered powerful families. Once the label of witchcraft was applied, political and personal grievances merged into a single, dangerous narrative. The involvement of secular rulers in witch trials often mirrored their broader political needs. In times of instability, pursuing witches could serve as a demonstration of authority and moral vigilance, reassuring subjects that the ruler was both protector and judge. Public executions became spectacles that reinforced loyalty to the governing power. For the church, political alliances could determine the vigor of witch prosecutions. In regions where bishops sought favor with rulers, cooperation in rooting out alleged witches could strengthen ties. Conversely, in places where ecclesiastical authority clashed with secular governance, disputes over trials could deepen rifts, with each side accusing the other of negligence or overreach. International rivalries sometimes colored the perception of witchcraft itself. Propaganda could depict neighboring lands as infested with witches, reinforcing cultural prejudices and justifying political hostility. Such portrayals painted the opponent not only as a worldly adversary, but as a spiritual danger, merging territorial ambition with the defense of the faith. In this complex interplay, witchcraft trials became more than judicial acts. They were tools of political theatre. Behind the accusations and confessions lay struggles for power, influence, and survival. The devil's image loomed large, but it often served to mask the human ambitions that truly guided the hand of accusation. The spread of the printing press in the mid-15th century transformed how information about witchcraft circulated in Europe. Before its invention, accounts of trials, theological treatises, and legal manuals had to be copied by hand, limiting their reach. Printing allowed these works to be reproduced in large numbers, ensuring that ideas once confined to localities could now influence entire regions. This technological shift gave witch hunting a new momentum, uniting distant courts under shared texts and imagery. Trial records, pamphlets, and broadsheets carried sensational stories to readers who might otherwise never have encountered such cases. Detailed confessions, often extracted under torture, were printed alongside moral warnings, presenting them as cautionary tales for the faithful. By turning legal proceedings into public narratives, the press fueled both fear and fascination, making witchcraft a subject of common conversation far beyond the courtroom. Witch hunting manuals, such as the Malleus Maleficarum, found new life in print. Once available only to a select group of scholars and clergy, these guides now reached secular judges, local officials, and literate townsfolk. Their systematic methods, theological arguments, and vivid descriptions of diabolical acts became widely known, shaping public expectations of what a witch was and how they should be identified. Illustrations added a potent dimension to this printed culture. Woodcuts depicted witches flying through the night, meeting with demons, or casting spells over cauldrons. These images provided a visual vocabulary that fixed certain ideas in the popular imagination. Even for those who could not read, the images told a clear and memorable story, reinforcing the fear of a hidden, ever-present threat. The press also allowed local hunts to inspire others. A dramatic trial in one town, once a local matter, could be reported in another within weeks, complete with names, charges, and outcomes. This created a sense of urgency and competition, as authorities sought to demonstrate their own vigilance by initiating similar proceedings. The result was a pattern of regional waves of prosecution, often sparked by distant events. While the printing press spread the tools of persecution, it also quietly planted the seeds of skepticism. Some writers began to question the validity of the confessions and the justice of the trials, and their works, too, found readers. Although these voices were few in the height of the hunts, the technology that magnified fear would later serve to circulate arguments for restraint and reform. The impact of printed accounts on public memory was profound. Generations after a trial ended, its records could still be read, keeping alive the perception that witchcraft was an enduring danger. The permanence of print turned transient fears into a lasting historical narrative, shaping how communities remembered their past and justified future actions. In the age of print, witchcraft ceased to be a purely local concern. It became part of a shared European story, written in ink, bound in books, and carried by merchants, travelers, and clergy across borders. The printing press gave the witch hunts not only a voice, but an echo that could travel farther and last longer than any single trial. The 16th century brought deep fractures to Christendom, as the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation reshaped the religious map of Europe. Both sides claimed to defend the true faith, yet in their struggle against each other, they shared a common conviction. Witchcraft was real, dangerous, and needed to be eradicated. Far from diminishing the hunts, the schism often intensified them, as each confession sought to prove its moral vigilance through the prosecution of witches. In Protestant territories, reformers denounced what they saw as the corruption of the Catholic Church, but did not abandon belief in the devil's active presence. Figures like Martin Luther and John Calvin preached that witches were the devil's servants, conspiring to harm God's people. Their words carried weight in shaping local attitudes, encouraging magistrates to act decisively against suspected practitioners of sorcery. The Catholic response was equally uncompromising. As part of its Counter-Reformation efforts, the Church emphasized doctrinal purity and the defense of the faithful from spiritual threats. Inquisitors in Catholic lands pursued witches with the same fervor as heretics, treating both as enemies of God. The religious wars that swept across Europe created a climate of heightened suspicion, in which accusations could be framed as part of a broader battle between good and evil. This confessional rivalry sometimes produced competitive zeal. A Protestant town might point to the number of witches it had executed as proof of its moral discipline, while a Catholic region could claim similar actions as evidence of its faithfulness. Such comparisons reinforced the idea that eradicating witchcraft was a mark of true devotion, regardless of theological differences. In regions where the two confessions bordered one another, the fear of witches could take on a political edge. Authorities were keen to demonstrate that their own lands were purer and safer than their neighbors. Trials could thus serve as both spiritual purges and public statements of legitimacy, assuring subjects that their leaders were defenders of divine order. The sermons and pamphlets of the era linked witchcraft to the great cosmic struggle between God and the devil, now mirrored in the visible division of the Church. Believers were urged to remain vigilant, for the enemy could be within their own community. This message found fertile ground in a century marked by war, famine, and plague, conditions that often fueled accusations. Despite the shared intensity, differences emerged in practice. Some Protestant regions placed more emphasis on secular courts, while Catholic territories often relied on ecclesiastical judges. Yet in both systems, the outcome for the accused was much the same: trial, confession under pressure, and execution if guilt was declared. The Reformation era thus bound witchcraft more tightly to the identity of confessional faith. To fight witches was to fight for the soul of the Church itself, whether in Wittenberg or Rome. In this way, the religious upheavals of the 16th century did not temper the hunts. They gave them new fuel, casting them as part of a holy war that neither side could afford to lose. Across Europe, the prosecution of witchcraft followed no single path. While the core beliefs about the devil's pact and harmful magic were widely shared, the intensity and methods of enforcement varied greatly from one region to another. Local laws, traditions, and political climates all shaped how accusations were handled, and these differences could mean the contrast between a formal reprimand and the stake. In the Holy Roman Empire, especially in the German-speaking territories, witch hunts were often fierce and sustained. Fragmented political authority meant that numerous small jurisdictions could conduct their own trials without a central body imposing restraint. This decentralized system, combined with strong local belief in diabolical conspiracy, produced some of the deadliest persecutions in Europe, with entire villages sometimes losing significant portions of their population. France experienced its own waves, particularly in regions like Lorraine and Franche-Comté, but enforcement there was less uniform. In some provinces, secular courts dominated, while in others, ecclesiastical judges took the lead. The results could differ sharply. One area might demand rigorous proof, while another acted swiftly on rumour and confession alone. Scotland's trials stood out for their severity relative to population size. Influenced by both Calvinist theology and political turbulence, the Scottish authorities conducted periodic sweeps in which large numbers of suspects were interrogated, often using methods designed to force quick admissions. Belief in witches' marks and the testimony of professional witch-finders played a prominent role in these prosecutions. In Spain, by contrast, the Inquisition generally displayed more restraint than in many northern countries. While it investigated witchcraft, it often emphasized the need for concrete evidence and sometimes released those accused if proof was lacking. This cautious approach stemmed in part from earlier experiences with false accusations in other heresy cases, leading Spanish inquisitors to be wary of mass hysteria. The Scandinavian kingdoms saw varied patterns as well. Denmark and Norway had significant waves of witch hunting, often tied to royal authority and state law, while Sweden's infamous Great Noise of the late 17th century revealed how child testimony and visions could drive large-scale trials. Climate hardship and social tension in these northern lands gave accusations particular force. Even within a single country, local culture could influence the process. In some alpine valleys, belief in night-flying witches and weather magic dominated cases. In coastal regions, accusations might focus on shipwrecks or fishing failures. The same theological framework could thus take on different shapes depending on the needs and fears of the community. These regional variations remind us that the witch hunts were not a single uniform campaign imposed from above, but a complex patchwork of local actions shaped by law, custom, and circumstance. While the language of the Devil's Pact united the charges, the lived reality of the trials reflected the diversity and the divisions of Europe itself. By the late 17th century, the fervour that had once fueled church-led witch trials began to wane. Skepticism among some clergy and legal scholars challenged the reliability of confessions obtained under torture and questioned the theological assumptions behind the prosecutions. The idea that every misfortune could be traced to diabolical influence no longer carried the same unquestioned authority it once had in the pulpit or the courtroom. One factor in this decline was the growing influence of secular courts. As state power strengthened, rulers sought to centralize justice under their own authority, limiting the reach of ecclesiastical tribunals. Cases of alleged witchcraft were increasingly handled by civil judges, whose procedures were often less driven by theological considerations and more by emerging standards of evidence. Within the church itself, a quiet shift was underway. Some theologians began to stress pastoral care and moral reform over punitive measures. The confessional, once a place where admissions of folk practices could lead to prosecution, became more focused on guiding penitents back to orthodoxy rather than delivering them to trial. This change reflected both theological caution and a desire to distance the church from the excesses of earlier hunts. Public opinion also played a role. Communities that had seen entire families destroyed by accusations sometimes began to resist further trials, recalling past injustices. In some places, local leaders refused to pursue charges unless the evidence was overwhelming, effectively halting the cycle of denunciation and prosecution. The growing body of literature challenging witch hunting further weakened its ecclesiastical momentum. Works by jurists and philosophers argued that belief in night flights, Sabbaths, and shape-shifting lacked credible proof. While these critiques did not deny the existence of the devil, they urged a more rational and restrained approach to suspected cases of magic. International influences also mattered. Diplomatic exchanges, scientific correspondence, and travel exposed rulers and churchmen to regions where witch trials had already subsided. Seeing that other lands maintained order without mass prosecutions helped erode the argument that such measures were essential for the preservation of the faith. Even in the Inquisition's strongholds, the tone changed. By the early 18th century, Spanish and Italian inquisitors were far more likely to impose penance or exile than to hand over suspects for execution. The emphasis shifted toward correcting error rather than punishing it with death, signaling a profound change in the Church's approach to alleged witchcraft. This decline did not end belief in witches, but it marked the close of an era when the Church stood at the forefront of their prosecution. The machinery of accusation, trial, and execution that had once served as a pillar of religious authority was slowly dismantled, leaving behind both a cautionary legacy and a history that would be remembered with unease in the centuries to follow. As the 18th century unfolded, the intellectual climate of Europe began to shift under the currents of the Enlightenment. Philosophers, scientists, and reformers promoted reason, observation, and empirical evidence as the proper foundations of knowledge. In such a world, the elaborate demonological frameworks of the past found less fertile ground. The belief that unseen forces governed daily misfortunes was increasingly questioned by those who sought explanations in nature rather than in the supernatural. Legal reforms reflected this new approach. Jurists influenced by Enlightenment ideals called for stricter evidentiary standards, rejecting confessions obtained under torture as unreliable. The principle that extraordinary claims required extraordinary proof began to take hold in courtrooms. As a result, many witchcraft cases collapsed before reaching trial, not because belief had vanished entirely, but because the legal mechanisms could no longer sustain conviction. Scientific inquiry also eroded the foundations of witch persecution. Advances in medicine explained illnesses once attributed to curses, while studies of weather, agriculture, and astronomy provided natural causes for events previously seen as acts of maleficium. With each discovery, the space in which witchcraft could plausibly operate grew smaller. This intellectual transformation did not occur without resistance. Rural communities often held fast to older beliefs, and clergy in more isolated areas continued to preach vigilance against the devil's agents. Yet the voices calling for skepticism multiplied, and their influence reached the ears of monarchs and ministers who had the power to change laws and practices. Public discourse also began to turn. Pamphlets, essays, and books argued that witch hunts were relics of ignorance, unworthy of modern states. Some writers used the excesses of past trials as moral lessons, framing them as warnings against the dangers of fear-driven justice. The very stories that had once inspired prosecutions now served as evidence of their injustice. In some countries, official decrees formally abolished the prosecution of witchcraft as a criminal offense. Where such laws remained on the books, they were often ignored in practice, replaced by charges of fraud, poisoning, or public disorder when harm could be proven. The separation of religious belief from legal judgment became an important marker of progress in Enlightenment thought. The changing climate even reached the pulpit. Some theologians reinterpreted biblical passages once used to justify the execution of witches, arguing that they spoke to idolatry or false prophecy, rather than the folk practices of their own time. This theological softening aligned the Church, in part, with the new rationalist spirit, though not without controversy. By the close of the century, the Enlightenment had transformed witchcraft from a pressing danger into a subject for historians, moralists, and skeptics. The age of mass trials was over, replaced by an era in which the fear of witches belonged more to the memory of a darker past than to the realities of the present. The law, once an instrument of belief, was becoming a tool of reason. By the dawn of the 18th century, the tide of witch persecution had ebbed across much of Europe, yet isolated prosecutions continued. In certain rural or politically isolated regions, older beliefs held firm, and local authorities, both ecclesiastical and secular, still acted on them. These final church-sanctioned executions reveal how deeply entrenched the fear of witchcraft could remain, even as the intellectual and legal climate shifted towards skepticism. One of the most notable late cases occurred in the Prince-Bishopric of Salzburg in the 1740s. There, a series of trials targeted young people accused of participating in diabolical pacts and weather magic. The ecclesiastical court, operating with both religious and temporal authority, condemned several to death. These executions shocked observers elsewhere in Europe, where such punishments had largely been abandoned. Earlier in the century, in Switzerland's Protestant and Catholic territories alike, small-scale executions still took place, showing that the decline was not strictly tied to confession. In some cantons, community pressure outweighed legal reform, pushing reluctant magistrates to act. The persistence of such cases demonstrated that legal abolition was only part of the process. Cultural change moved far more slowly. In Poland, scattered witch trials continued into the late 1700s, sometimes ending in death sentences carried out with local clerical approval. The influence of village priests, combined with strong rural traditions, meant that Enlightenment reforms in the cities did not always reach the countryside. These last prosecutions reflected a gap between official policy and the lived reality of remote communities. The Church's direct role in these later executions was often more symbolic than procedural. Bishops or parish priests might not preside over the trials themselves, but their moral authority lent weight to the proceedings. Sermons warning against the devil's work could still inspire fear, reinforcing the legitimacy of local accusations. Such cases often carried an air of finality, as if the communities conducting them sensed they were closing a chapter. The rhetoric used in these trials echoed that of earlier centuries, portraying the accused as an existential threat to the faith. Yet in many instances, these executions drew criticism from neighboring regions, suggesting that the broader cultural consensus had shifted. By the end of the 18th century, most European states had either repealed laws against witchcraft or rendered them unenforceable. The last recorded church-sanctioned executions stood out as anachronisms, reminders of a judicial tradition that no longer aligned with the prevailing spirit of the age. They were, in effect, the last shadows cast by a sun already set. These final deaths closed a grim era in which the Church's judicial arm had been entwined with the fear of witchcraft. Though the age of mass hunts was over, the memory of these executions endured as a cautionary tale, evidence that even in a time of reason, fear could still claim the authority to take life in the name of God. The centuries of church-led witch trials left marks that extended far beyond the individuals accused. They shaped cultural memory, legal traditions, and the relationship between faith and authority. In many regions, these trials became part of local history, their stories retold for generations as warnings, moral lessons, or grim curiosities. The shadow they cast was long, coloring perceptions of justice and religious power well into the modern era. One enduring legacy was the way fear could be formalized into law. The Church's integration of theological doctrine with judicial procedure demonstrated how belief could drive the machinery of prosecution. This fusion of faith and legal authority became a model, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously, for later forms of moral policing, even when witchcraft itself was no longer the focus. The trials also reinforced deep cultural stereotypes, particularly regarding women. The disproportionate targeting of widows, healers, and midwives left a lingering association between female independence and suspicion. Though witchcraft laws were eventually repealed, the social attitudes they reflected and encouraged persisted in subtler forms, influencing gender relations long after the last execution. In the realm of theology, the hunts cemented a vision of the devil as an active, organized force in human affairs. This imagery endured in sermons, literature, and art, shaping Christian discourse well beyond the period of prosecutions. The idea of a hidden enemy working through human agents remained a potent metaphor in religious teaching, even when applied to entirely different threats. For legal history, the witch trials became a case study in the dangers of extraordinary procedures. The acceptance of torture, the lowering of evidentiary standards, and the use of coerced confession left a legacy that later reformers would explicitly reject. In many ways, the Enlightenment's legal advances were framed in direct opposition to the excesses of these trials. Communities that experienced large-scale hunts often carried a collective memory of betrayal and loss. Families of the accused might find their names permanently stained, their property confiscated, and their social standing diminished for generations. The social fractures caused by accusations sometimes never fully healed, creating divisions that outlasted the events themselves. On a broader scale, the Church's involvement in witch trials became a point of criticism for future generations, both within and outside the faith. It served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and the consequences of merging spiritual and judicial power. This reflection, though often uncomfortable, played a role in shaping modern ideas about religious freedom and the separation of powers. The legacy of these trials is therefore twofold: a reminder of the harm caused when fear overrides justice, and a source of historical reflection that has informed more measured approaches to law and belief. The Church's role in them remains a subject of debate, repentance, and study, a testament to how the past continues to speak, even when its darkest chapters are long closed. Looking back on the long history of witch trials, one sees not only a record of persecution, but also a mirror held up to the human condition. The events reveal how fear, when given structure and authority, can overwhelm reason and compassion. They show how communities, driven by the need for certainty in uncertain times, can sacrifice justice in pursuit of safety. These lessons remain as relevant now as they were centuries ago. The fusion of religious authority with judicial power stands out as a central warning. When the same institution controls both the definition of sin and the punishment for it, the safeguards against abuse weaken. The witch trials remind us that even well-intentioned guardians of morality can, under the pressure of fear, become agents of injustice. Separation of powers is not only a political principle, but a moral one. Another enduring lesson is the danger of lowering standards of proof in times of crisis. The acceptance of rumor, spectral evidence, and coerced confession eroded the very foundations of fair judgment. History shows that extraordinary claims demand greater scrutiny, not less, and that abandoning this principle invites the punishment of the innocent. The trials also reveal how prejudice can hide beneath the language of piety and law. Gender, social standing, and personal enmities shaped who was accused and convicted. Recognizing these biases is essential to preventing their repetition in new forms. Injustice often wears the garb of righteousness, making vigilance all the more necessary. Equally important is the recognition of how public consensus can drive persecution. In many cases, it was not only rulers and clerics who sought out witches, but also neighbors and kin. This warns against the belief that injustice comes solely from above. It can rise just as powerfully from the ground level, fueled by the voices of the many rather than the command of the few. The eventual decline of the witch hunts illustrates the power of questioning established narratives. The spread of skepticism, the demand for better evidence, and the willingness to re-examine long-held beliefs all played a role in ending the prosecutions. Change was slow, but it began with individuals willing to ask if the accepted truth might be wrong. These lessons point toward the importance of preserving critical thought in public life. Education, open discourse, and the protection of dissenting voices form the best defense against the return of such moral panics. A society that values inquiry over conformity is less likely to repeat the errors of the past. In the end, the history of the Church's witch trials is not only a record of what was done, but a guide to what must be avoided. The past offers its counsel in the hope that future generations will heed it, that fear will not be allowed to dictate justice, and that truth will be sought with patience, humility, and care.